quite gratifying to actually know the interest that some of our younger generation, the youth members, have in trying to understand and grapple with the international issues. And I hope the larger community would imbibe this kind of a perspective and also this kind of a interest. Right at the outset, I must underscore that I'm not essentially a scholar on international politics. I'm basically a sinologist, meaning that I teach Chinese studies, history and politics, and also a little bit on science and technology, and development and inequality in India and China. But however, what I have been doing of late is to try and understand the larger context. What I shall also be doing this evening is to look at the global politics or international relations through the Chinese prism, or through the Chinese lenses, mainly because of the way in which China at the moment is trying to create its own space in the global politics and change the dynamics. I think it is in this context that I shall try and look at international politics. And you might find a little more discussion on China. I think that's partly because of the professional, I would say, association with the Chinese studies. And I'm sure looking at global politics through the Chinese lenses would also open new avenues and also new vistas in the way in which international relations are unfolding. So with these, a few words, may I, begin the presentation. I think recently I have, basically told that I should do a PowerPoint presentation. So I have made a brief PowerPoint presentation. I hope you would have a clear understanding of what we are trying to fathom and also grapple with. Let me start the presentation, share my screen. Yeah, as I'm sure many of you would have read the article that I've recently written, and I think it has been shared by Brother Satish. I think I hope you've read, some of you have read and come. So what I'm going to do is to try and unpack the various facets of contemporary international relations, focusing on the changing dynamics, challenges, and responses, because unless we understand the changing dynamics and the kind of challenges that are unfolding at the moment, the kind of responses that we evolve would be inadequate. And therefore, I think there is an imperative to understand the contemporary international relations. By way of introduction, as the paper would indicate, that the contemporary international relations are going through an inflection point, meaning it is at a very critical juncture in the way in which it is at this point of time is unfolding. One of the things that actually one makes this kind of a assertion or proposition that why we are at an inflection point is mainly because of what happened in the last 6 or 7 months with the emergence of COVID-19. What we find with the COVID-19 pandemic and the way in which a small virus that actually brought the international community as it were, to its knees. Uh, what we also find because of this pandemic is that you have a number of lives that were lost. The global economy is crippled, adversely affecting farmers, laborers, and particularly the migrant laborers in countries like India. And we've seen a number of those very painful images where our migrant laborers, uh, walking hundreds, in some cases, thousands of kilometers, which basically is an indication of the way that we have responded to this global pandemic. In addition to that, the higher education, and in fact, all forms of education, the schools, colleges, all of them have also faced the wrath of this pandemic with the closure of the entire education system and forcing us to move towards a digital platform, which is why I think one of the reasons why we are all, all thanks to technology, meeting together on this digital platform. So what this pandemic basically underscores is that the global community failed to be united in responding and evolving a credible and well calibrated strategy. In fact, they also underestimated the virulence of this pandemic, which is why some countries like the US emerged as the country with the largest number of COVID positive cases, and also the largest number of deaths as well. So this happening in a country that is actually spearheading the global community underscores some kind of a problem with the international community. And also, we also find some element of change within the international politics. We also see, in addition, a two-forked scepter of authoritarianism and economic nationalism, which can actually, undermine the international system that has been painstakingly constructed since 1940s. In fact, the authoritarianism, which I will try and unpack a little later, this is basically by way of introduction. But at the same time, we have a very interesting silver lining in the midst of this pandemic, in the form of a revival of civil society and its impact on global politics in the recent past. For instance, Occupy Wall Street and Jasmine Revolution and protests at World Economic Forum and also environment summits are the things that actually highlight the way in which the global community is facing a number of challenges. And in addition to these two, of forked scepter of authoritarianism and economic nationalism, we also find the number of wars and conflicts and refugee crises. For instance, we have ongoing wars in Syria, Yemen, and Ukraine. Of course, conflicts in Iraq, Libya, Mali, and also in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And of course, even Congo, Sudan, and South Sudan. All of these also, indicate an element of a crisis with the global community. In fact, there are about 40 ongoing conflicts ravaging at this point in time. And according to the UNHCR, United Nations Human Commission for Refugees, in fact, picks the number of the global refugees at about a staggering 26 million. That, in fact, tells us about the way in which the international relations have, in some ways, failed to address some of these crises. And what I intend to do in this particular presentation is to first look at the changing dynamics. And also the second section will highlight India-China relations, partly because India-China relations are a microcosm of the international politics. And then the discussion will move towards some of the challenges that we've been grappling with. Coupled with that, we will also throw some light. I shall throw some light on the responses that various segments of the international community and also the institutions, including India, then the and also individuals as individuals, how we need to respond to this changing dynamics of international relations. And I will end with a few concluding remarks. And I hope this structure would help you to understand the international dynamics at the moment. And what I'm going to do is basically in this next few minutes to give you a snapshot. I know this is not a very comprehensive discussion on international politics, but this is going to be a kind of a bird's eye view of international politics. But the way I approach this international politics is from the vantage point of those who are on the margins, those who are being exploited, those who are being persecuted in some ways, and also those who are being pushed to the corners of or to the periphery of the international politics. Coming to the issue of international relations, the changing dynamics. First of all, much of the international institutions that we have are, in fact, in some ways, the products of the 20th century. Now that we are in the 21st century, we need to go back to the 20th century, partly because of the contribution of the 20th century to the evolution of the global system. In fact, in the 20th century, we had the League of Nations in the 1920s and the United Nations organization being established in the 1940s, basically indicate how these institutions came into existence. By the way, I must also underscore here that these institutions came into being in the crucible of two world wars that ravaged the world, leading to the death of millions of the Asians, Europeans, and Americans. So that, the crisis that the global community went through in the 1910s and then after that in the 1930s, leading to the evolution of the existing institutions. Therefore, I think one must factor this into our analysis. But then soon after these two world wars, we actually entered into another interesting phase, a phase of Cold War, a Cold War that was basically fought on the ideological line that we see Cold War unfolding from late 1940s, in some cases, some would argue from 1950s, and then it ended in 1991 with the disintegration of the erstwhile USSR. So therefore, I think this element of the Cold War is also something that we need to keep in mind as we understand the international relations with a focus on changing dynamics. But now, with the end of the Cold War, for the last 3 decades or so, we have only one superpower, the lone superpower in the United States, that is dominating the global politics, the international relations, trying to
Yes.
ensure that the global community follows some of the ideas and the ideals that it espouses. So therefore, I think this kind of a background before we actually try and understand some of the changing dynamics in the next few minutes or so. So the first uh, major, you know, changing dynamic that we need to, uh, bring into our discussion is the current phase of globalization. By the way, many scholars would argue that globalization started only recently, but I would actually argue that globalization has been with us from times immemorial. Now, with the evolution of societies, we've been going through different phases of globalization, and therefore, one has to look at this globalization as the current phase of globalization. And this current phase of globalization is essentially undergirded by the technological prowess or the technological capabilities in the form of particularly information and communication technologies. Because if we are together as a global community today, it is primarily because of the technological development. And some countries have actually strengthened their technological capabilities, like the US and some of the European countries and Japan and now China and of course India. India is of course known as technological soft power, while China is known as technological hardware power. So it is in this context, with the current phase of globalization, what we find is the emergence of knowledge economies, meaning the economies that we have today are essentially knowledge-centered, knowledge-based economies. Uh, you look at KPOs, BPOs, all of these knowledge processing, offices or business processing offices. All of these are essentially an integral part of these knowledge economies. And together with that, we also find this uh, beginning of information society. Again, another phase of information society, wherein we have uh, information explosion, where we are flooded with, like somebody was saying, like these webinars, we're also flooded with this information, whether it is on your laptops or on your mobile phones or on your iPads. Uh, Wherever you turn, you find information being readily available and accessible. I think this is one interesting changing dynamic. So therefore, what this changing dynamic involves is that we understand this better, so that as Indians and as a global community, we would all try and adapt, even as Alvin Toffler would argue in a number of his books. For instance, the future shock. Now, how we need to basically grapple with, especially some of us who are in our 50s and 60s, we find it difficult to adjust to these technological changes. But then, thanks to our children, we are able to grapple with a lot of these. So therefore, I think this is one important element. And together with this current phase of globalization, we also find the multinational corporations or the companies, they are also playing a major role in the way in which globalization is currently being shaped. And we have today $1 trillion companies, whether it is Apple or Amazon, and some of them are slowly moving towards $1 trillion companies. What is happening is they are, in some ways, usurping some of the powers that the state, generally the states, do have, leading to some kind of a dilution of state sovereignty. Because in the international relations, state sovereignty is given a primacy, because in fact, at the end of the day, international relations are essentially led by some of these state institutions. As globalization is unfolding the current phase, we also find two other interesting dimensions. For instance, the element of globalization, wherein there is a very interesting fusion between globalization and localization. I know we try to find the global elements in the local and the local elements in the global. And in addition to this, we do also see another interesting element or phase of deglobalization, wherein some countries, given their own national interests, are slowly moving towards deglobalization, meaning trying to move away from globalization. A case in point is United Kingdom, which is in some ways trying to move out of EU. In fact, when European Union was conceived, UK was one of the strong proponents. But today, it is slowly moving out of European Union. But of course, it cannot really completely, be away from globalization, because globalization, in some ways, is an element that would definitely change the dynamics. And together with this is a second most important, changing dynamic that we find, which is new multilateralism, which is in some contrast to the old multilateralism. In fact, the new multilateralism is essentially led by the developing countries, unlike the old multilateralism. Multilateralism is basically a kind of a process where the relations are basically structured in a multilateral context, not in a bilateral, not in a two-way, but in a multi-pronged context. In fact, this new multilateralism in some ways is led by some of the developing countries, and particularly China. In fact, you can see the Chinese imprint on this in the formation of institutions like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, for instance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Another multilateral forum that has been in operation for more than a decade. And you also have AIIB, Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Then there is also the New Development Bank, that is again in some ways influenced and shaped by the Chinese. But the old multilateralism was essentially led by the West. As we just discussed a little while ago, the formation of UNO, or even the World Bank or IMF in the 20th century, were all the creation of the West. So therefore, there is a very interesting, paradigm shift, as it were, from old multilateralism to new multilateralism. And this brings me to the third most important, changing dynamic that we find within the international relations is the contestation and conflict between the reigning superpower and a rising China, or rise of China. This is actually quite intriguing because China is actually trying to expand its global footprint in order to create its own space and influence the global system. So whenever there is this contestation between a reigning superpower and rise of China, which we've seen in history, for instance, at one point of time, UK was the reigning superpower in the 19th century. Then we've seen the rise of the United States, and together with the United States, the USSR rose and, of course, declined. But now China is actually trying to take that space that was, in fact, left by the erstwhile USSR, or currently Russia. So in this contestation, what we find is a kind of a new phase of a new Cold War, unlike the old Cold War. In fact, the old Cold War was fought on the ideological grounds, but today the new Cold War is going to be fought on the issue of ideas, and and we also see the recent trade tariffs that both the US and China imposed on each other's products, and also much more recently, about a week back, in the last 10 days or so, we've also witnessed the closure of the consulates, both in the US and in China, one in Texas, the other one in Sichuan province. So what we find in this process is that China is actually, trying to, carve a niche for itself in the global system, while the US is trying to retain its hold over the international politics. So there is always going to be this kind of a difference between, the old and the new Cold Wars ideology and ideas. So this brings us to the interesting dimension of what is the nature of international relations. How does actually one understand the nature of international relations at this point? The One of the IR scholars by name Paul Kennedy, uh, in fact, highlighted that the international relations are essentially an arena of great power politics, meaning at the uh, you know top of the pyramid of international relations, we find the great power politics unfolding. It is in this context, especially in the last few decades, there has been a kind of a shift in our understanding from great power politics to a kind of a reconfiguration of international relations from great politics to cultural or civilizational identities. In fact, Samuel Huntington, one of the very insightful scholars, in his very interesting book, The Clash of Civilizations, underscored how currently, or rather in the last 3 decades or so, the emergence of a paradigm shift from great power politics to cultural and civilizational identities. And more interestingly, one of our own scholars, Vinod Ramchandra, um, uh, wrote a very interesting book titled Faiths in Conflict, which basically tried to highlight how faiths are also, in many ways, quite central to the international politics that we are witnessing at this point of time. So what we are basically witnessing at this point is, there are those who say that international relations are going through some sort of a chaos, but more accurately, as Ilstrip, Sangiovani, and Hoffman would argue, it is actually not going through a period of chaos, but actually a transformation from within. That there is a kind of a transformation that is, occurring within the international relations at this point of time. In trying to understand the international relations, we have had a number of scholars postulating interesting, phrases. And one of the phrases is a phrase called unipolar, wherein you have only one country, like for instance, the US, is the dominant player. John Eikenberry is one of the scholars who basically wrote this interesting, article and book on how the United States is still the dominant player in changing the dynamics of international relations. You can see its impact on the various institutions, whether it is in the UN or climate change institutions, or the World Bank or IMF. Wherever you see the American imprint, uh, writ large, in a way that we find that it's difficult to see international politics without the United States. So wherever you go, whichever part of the world that you go, you find the United States and its imprint uh, across the world. The second phrase that is also proposed by some scholars is the phrase called bipolar, wherein the international relations at the moment is going through a kind of a process whereby both US and China are the dominant players. In fact, Bruce Jones is one of the scholars who wrote something on this very interesting element. But then he also highlighted that it is more of an asymmetry, meaning the US is the senior partner because of its experience, and China is a junior partner, partly because of the asymmetry that exists between US and China, whether it is in terms of their influence in global politics or the size of their economies, because the US is the largest economy and China is the second largest. And we also find the US, and its presence in Asia, whereas we don't see much of a Chinese presence, whether it is in North America or in Europe, though of course its investments are there. But in terms of its military presence or its political prowess, we don't find the Chinese being as powerful as the Americans are. And interestingly, there is also another phrase called multipolar world, where you have scholars like Amitav Acharya and many others try to uh, de depict the international politics as multipolar. And in fact, Amitav Acharya came up with this interesting phrase called multiplex, that one has to look at international relations as a multiplex, wherein, as you see in these multiplexes, a number of movies being shown at the same time. He would say a number of countries, in addition to P5, meaning the 5 UN Security Council members, US, China, Russia, UK, and France. In addition to that, we also have India, Germany, Japan, Brazil, and South Africa trying to make their own presence felt in the international politics. So this is actually, in many ways, is an attempt to make international politics much more egalitarian, much more inclusive. But then, and in fact, the UN reform is one of the attempts. In fact, India, Germany, Japan, and to a certain extent South Africa, they have been in the forefront trying to bring in UN reform so that they will have their presence within the UNSC, and then thereby change the international dynamics. In trying to understand international politics, a number of IR scholars came up with a number of IR theories, international relations theories. And what I'm going to do is to quickly take you through these 5 theories that I've thought of, so that you will have some idea. First is liberalism, wherein the primacy is given to the values of democracy and institutional norms. But at the same time, the state is in the lead within this liberalism theoretical framework. In other words, liberalism, highlights that we must, focus more on democracy and institutional norms, but at the same time, the state being in the lead. Scholars like Robert Kohane and Francis Fukuyama are some of the strong proponents of liberalism. And then you have realism and neorealism, wherein the state is the main player within this architecture. But then the states actually in this theoretical framework, basically try to maximize their political power. In other words, their entire focus is on maximizing their power, so that they will try and influence global politics more than others. Hans Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz are some of its uh, robust proponents. And then you have constructivism, which basically privileges identities. But interestingly, in this framework, it is not the state which is the dominant player, but it is the elite with their ideas, particularly their creative ideas, how they can actually try and uh, influence the global politics. And then you have critical IR theory. Here, this particular theory focuses on creating a just world order. Uh, you know, what they argue is that the existing international system is something that is unjust. It doesn't, focus on the people on the margins or the communities in the margins, and therefore, scholars like Robert Cox and Andrew Linklater, they highlight that there is an imperative to actually change the world order and create a kind of a just world order. And together with these four is the fifth, theory, which is feminism. Mainly because if you look at international relations, there is this invisible women in wherever you see across the world, and therefore the emphasis is on making the invisible visible. And when we look at international politics, we don't see many women being part of the global politics. And therefore, feminism tries to highlight the need for, women being part and parcel of decision making at various levels, beginning at the international level and then slowly. And of course, it has to begin at the national level and then go to the international level. But what we find within the changing dynamics and in the way in which we are trying to understand with the three phases and these perspectives is the changing architecture of power. What we find within the international politics is the changing architecture of power. As we've basically underscored that it is power that is at the heart of international relations, and therefore the countries are basically trying to maximize their power. And for Morgenthau, international politics, like all politics, is a struggle for power. So therefore, the states are basically trying to maximize. But in trying to unpack the changing architecture of power, the scholars came up with three interesting kinds of power. One is hard power, the other one is soft power, and the third one is a smart power, which is a combination. The hard power is essentially a military power, meaning if you have one of the largest and most sophisticated military in the world, then you are basically seen as a hard power. For instance, countries like the US and China are basically seen as hard powers, and of course, various other countries with large and sophisticated or advanced military establishments. And then you also have the interesting phrase called soft power, wherein the cultural components are given primacy, and they, in fact, play a key role in basically spreading the tentacles of your power. Whether it is, for instance, the Chinese have their own soft power in terms of Confucius institutes, or India, for instance, in the recent past, we've been, using our yoga in order to, strengthen our own presence in the global politics. And together with this, and the third one is the smart power, which is essentially a combination of hard and soft power, wherein you combine the two. In fact, the former President Barack Obama was one of them who, in fact, strived to use this smart power in the American foreign policy during his 8-year term, or 2 terms at the Capitol Hill. at the Oval Office. And in trying to expand the discussion on these three kinds of power, there is also another term which is called comprehensive national power, which is a combination of political, economic, and cultural power that one can have. In addition to these three is science, technology, and innovation. Meaning, if a country has a robust science and technology in terms of innovation, in terms of products, and also patents, and also publications, with a substantial amount of gross expenditure on R&D, research and development, then you are basically seen to be a country with comprehensive national power. In fact, this is one of the terms that China, tried to, project as, its own creative, idea. But what we find within this architecture of power is that principles, or the power of principles, are being neglected. Quite often we find the principles are principles of equality, justice, and dignity for all are being marginalized, leading to conflicts across the world. And we also find this marginalization of the principles leading to contestation at various levels, and therefore there is an imperative to balance the two, power with principles and principles with power. This is something that, of course, the US tried doing it, but a number of times it actually strayed away from some of the principles, or tried to interpret some of those principles in the way that benefited its national interests, and and thereby creating conflict in the global community. And it is against this backdrop, what I'm going to do is to try and look at India-China relations, partly because India-China relations are a microcosm of the macro international relations. And right at the outset, we must factor into our analysis the element of asymmetry between these two Asian giants. Our former Prime Minister, just said Asia is large enough for both India and China, basically to suggest that we must try and avoid conflict. But unfortunately, that is not true, given what has been happening in the last few months. So the asymmetry, the element of asymmetry, can be seen in a number of segments. For instance, political. Then we also find in the economic realm. Politically, for instance, India, is just a UNSC a permanent member without any veto, but whereas China is a UNSC permanent member within that P5, but also it has a veto power. In other words, if any country tries to promote or propose a kind of a legislation against China, then China can actually veto it, and then it can never be discussed, in the United Nations Security Council, which is the core of the core of international politics. And in terms of the economic element, what we find is India is just the 5th largest economy in the world, whereas with about $2.9 trillion US dollar economy, whereas China is the 2nd largest with about $13 trillion US dollar economy, and the reserves again indicate a wide gulf between the two. While India has only $400 billion and China has about 3.1 trillion reserves. And in terms of science, technology and innovation, one of the indicators of S&T power that we generally measure is the gross expenditure on R&D. In fact, India spends only 0.70 of the budget of our GDP um, on R&D, which is quite less, whereas China spends about 2% of its R&D in ratio to GDP. So that also basically highlights the kind of gap that we find between India and China, and also in terms of patents and publications and innovations. We've seen a number of Chinese innovations in terms of their mobile, whether it is applications or mobile phones. We've seen a number of them, you know, you know, across the world. So therefore, I think one will have to basically look at the way in which these two countries are positioned. Uh, uh, India is in some ways is way below, in terms of a number of these indicators. And BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, which is, as some would argue, as a kind of the Chinese version of Marshall Plan that the U.S. Extended to the European reconstruction in the 1940s, the post Second World War, and this is actually is touted as one of the Chinese initiatives that is going to unite the world according to the Chinese national interest framework. But compare this with our own spice route or Mosam, plans that we also came up with. But unfortunately, in terms of their prowess, in terms of their contribution to the furtherance of our own national power, we are actually lagging behind. So what you find in this map in this table is basically the difference between India and China. And in terms of the cultural dimension, where of course China has been setting up about more than 400 Confucius institutes across the world. At one point of time, there were about 70 in the US to basically advance Chinese interests in the US. But of course, US closed down several of them. And China also tried to set up a number of them in India, including JNU, but didn't succeed in doing so because of our own insistence on controlling this. But China wanted to do it, but then we didn't allow that. So what basically these details indicate is that there is an element of asymmetry between India and China. And therefore, the imperative is that we need an accurate assessment, and neither underestimating or overestimating both the capabilities and strategies. In other words, we need to understand China better. I think it is in this context, one of the things that we must, try and fathom is whether China is a middle power or a great power or fragile superpower. In fact, Susan Shirk, one of the sinologists, she said, China is basically a fragile superpower. It is a superpower, but nevertheless, it is fragile because of the fault lines within the Chinese domestic context, particularly because of the problems that it has been, facing either from Tibet or from Xinjiang, the two autonomous regions within China that have been actually fighting for their own independence. And there are other scholars who would say it is only great power. They don't want to take China to that level of superpower. And then some would even actually position China only in the middle power. But then, of course, it is some power nevertheless. But I think we need to see, accurately whether it is fragile superpower. I think that seems to capture the the reality of the Chinese element. And in fact, Deng Xiaoping, one of the architects of the amazing and most successful economic reforms in the annals of history, Deng Xiaoping, who actually said that the crux of four modernizations is the development of science and technology. And he is the one who has actually put China on the map of the global map of science and technology. And he, when he began his, reign in some ways as a paramount leader in the late 1970s, after 1978, he said that that we must hide capabilities and bide time and harbor no ambitions, basically global ambitions. And during the same time, he also suggested two pillars of Chinese foreign policy. One, peace, and the other is development. He wanted a development within the domestic context and peace in the region. And in fact, apart from one misadventure in Vietnam, for which China got a bloody nose, and China, in fact, maintained relatively peaceful, relations with a number of countries in the 80s, but then 90s also to a certain extent. But of late, we see some element of flexing its muscles. In fact, under Xi Jinping, what we find is some element of showing capabilities and demonstrating that the time has come to show its global ambitions, whether it's the problem that we have on our border with China, or South China Sea, or the Chinese problem with Japan over Senkaku or Thiao Islands. These are some of the things that basically show a completely different reality. And China also, in fact, tried to promote the concept of harmonious world. In fact, one of my MPhil students did a MPhil dissertation on harmonious world, the concept of harmonious world. Whether it is rhetoric or reality is something that we must try and comprehend, so that we evolve a credible response, a well-calibrated response to China. So the framework of peace and development seems to have run its course, paving the way for a new framework in its approach to global politics and relations. And India-China relations can be seen in some ways, in a three-fold context: the global, the regional, and the bilateral. So what I'm going to do is to basically try and look at the India-China relations within this context. So globally, if you look at the Chinese footprint, can be seen in the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, as I indicated a while ago, and also China has also been one of the dominant players within BRICS. Because if we look at the economic prowess of China, in fact, the Chinese economy is more than the size of the economies of the other four countries: Russia, India, and South Africa. So that in itself tells us about the way in which China is a major dominant player within the BRICS multilateral framework. And also the Chinese role in Shanghai Cooperation Organization is pivotal. In fact, China is one that actually began this Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a Shanghai 5 initially, and then slowly expanded. And of course, India is also now given some sort of membership. And we also see the Chinese imprint globally at AIIB in terms of Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. In fact, AIIB is touted as a countervailing force to ADB. Asian Development Bank, which is essentially uh, you know, uh, Japan-led and supported by the United States. And what the Chinese are also doing in this global context is they're also, advancing their own, international relations theorization. Yan Suetong is one of them who is actually been contributing tremendously on this issue, so that both the practical elements, the praxis and theory, or theorizing international relations are going on simultaneously, so that one would reinforce the other. As you expand your global footprint, you also expand your theoretical framework, so that there is a very interesting confluence between these two, so that there is a consolidation of the praxis with your theory. But in this context, we find India is lagging, though of course our spice route and MOSM, these are of course there, to basically uh, stand against the Chinese expanding global footprint, but they're confined to Asia, but not really very global as much as one would have actually liked them. In terms of our theorization, scholars like Kanti Bajpai and Siddharth Malavarapur, they are my colleagues in JNU, and many others, even Raja Mohan and others, have been actually trying to theorize global politics to a great extent. We are also in some ways trying to match the Chinese, but I think we need to really improve both the praxis and theorization. And at the regional level, what we find is, as Booz Allen Hamilton, way back in 2003, argued that China was basically trying to weave a string of pearls around India. Take, for instance, its close relations with Pakistan, whether it is CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or its relations with Sri Lanka in terms of constructing a port, Ambotonta, and also its relations with Myanmar, and more recently Nepal and Bangladesh. We find China, in some ways is trying to weave this string of pearls, wherein it would actually, in some ways, restrict India to just South Asia, not going beyond South Asia. But of course, we've understood this dynamic, and then accordingly evolved our own spice route and MOSM to counter this. In fact, our close ties with Japan and also Vietnam in terms of our look east policy, which is of late rechristened as act east policy, was basically in some ways aimed at countering this string of pearls. So therefore, I think, it is regionally, we find the relations between India and China in some ways on an even keel. Bilaterally, especially after 1988, of course, we've seen what happened in 1962. But then after that conflict, we moved on, especially in 1988 with Rajiv Gandhi's visit to Beijing. We opened a new chapter in our relations, and then thereafter we came up with this comprehensive building measures in order to basically reduce the border conflict and also strengthen the bilateral relations, especially focusing on the economic relations. Then, as a result, we also see thriving trade between India and China. For instance, in 2019, we had about $93 billion bilateral trade. But unfortunately, this bilateral trade is in Chinese favor, with about more than $50 billion as a surplus trade in Chinese favor. that actually puts us in a very delicate position in our trade relations with China. And then there is also a more recent revival of strategic culture in India, especially with Kautilya's Ardhashastra, um, juxtaposing it to the Chinese own version of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. There is a very interesting development that we find within the bilateral context. But it is in this context that we must look at the border conflict. Why China, decided to basically create this border conflict. I think there are two plausible factors to understand this one, particularly the COVID debacle. In fact, especially the way in which China handled the pandemic, particularly in the initial phases, by suppressing information and also whistleblowers like Li Wenliang. What we find is that in order to divert the global attention away from China, and particularly the criticism that came from the United States and also Australia particularly, wherein Australia wanted a detailed investigation into the various issues pertaining to the COVID-19 in Wuhan, how the information was suppressed and how WHO, World Health Organization, was not really given the information. And this also, of course, created a lot more pressure on China. I think in order to release that pressure, we find China, try to create this. And the second one is about India-US bond homing. We find in the last few years, particularly in the last 6 years or so, there is a major India-US bond homing that we see. This is actually seen by China as a threat to its own global aspirations. So therefore, I think one will have to look at this, the larger context, in order to try and understand the bilateral context. In other words, the bilateral element is, intertwined with the global, processes. So how does actually one try and look at the relations between India and China? Is it conflict or there is mutuality? I think, of course, one cannot negate the presence of conflict, but at the same time, we can also, neglect the element of mutuality. I think we are mutually, in fact, as one would say, while you can choose your friend, but you cannot choose your neighbor. We are neighbors, and therefore there is bound to be a mutuality bilaterally, but also regionally and also globally. So how does one actually address this issue? In fact, there are 4 elements that I would like to flag at this point. Cooperation, yes, we need to cooperate with China wherever we must. And at the same time, we must be cautious, at every level, and recognizing that there is also the element of competition. We've been competing with China on a number of issues in various parts of the world, whether it is oil fields in Sudan and in Central Asia, and also we have a conflict. The border conflict is a case in point. But in trying to look at these 4 elements, we must bring in one of the very insightful African adages, which actually highlights as following. If you want to travel fast, travel alone. Let me reiterate. If you want to travel fast, travel alone. But if you want to travel far, travel together. But I think as neighbors, we want to really travel far, because international politics, international relations is a long journey, and in fact, we've been on this journey ever since humanity came into being in some form or the other. So therefore, we need to make sure that we are going to basically uh, focus on the element of both cooperation and also being wary of. So this brings me to the next major issue, which is the challenges. Uh, First of all, as I tried to allude uh, at some point, uh, the lack of unity within the international uh, relations is one that we need to keep in mind. And in doing so, which is evident in the way that we dealt with COVID-19. At the same time, there is also the element of serving the country and also serving the companies. There are some leaders who try to serve their companies more than, or their companies, or the companies that their relatives owned more than perhaps their own countries. Uh, and in the process, what is happening is the marginalization of the poor. I think this uh, is a very unfortunate element. I think that's where I think we need to really look at this as a major challenge. Together with this is the recent growing authoritarianism across the world, um, which basically, in some ways, led to high-handed treatment of the minorities and civil society, and we've seen that even in India and across the world. Uh, I think this is where we find the role of civil society um, being critically important, to basically withstand the onslaught of the authoritarian tendencies, whether at a national level or a regional level or even at the global level. The third is the rise of China. I think, as I said, that accurate estimation of the Chinese capabilities is important. What China, in some ways, is trying to do is to undermine the liberal values and democracy that the West tried to, you know, uh, you know, promote all these 70 years or so. Beijing consensus is one element, which is in some ways in contrast to the Washington consensus. And China also, has of late been juxtaposing three elements: fairness, justice, um, and also um, and civility, in contrast to the Western values of equality, freedom, and democracy. And what's going to happen in this conflict is that equality, freedom, and democracy perhaps would be undermined. I think that's where I think one will have to be very cautious about the Chinese global footprint. The fourth one, as I said, the wars and conflicts. What is happening is quite often the emphasis is more on the symptoms rather than the root causes. I think this is where the civil society and the states must come together to focus more on the root causes rather than the symptoms. I think this is where I must bring in what one of my favorite leaders, Martin Luther King Jr., who underscored, uh, basically he tried to look at peace in two very interesting dimensions: a negative peace, that basically a presence of peace with some kind of a conflict. But then he said, in contrast to negative peace, we must have positive peace, which basically underlines the presence of justice. The issue is whether we have justice being privileged in the international politics. That's where I think the civil society must try and strive hard to ensure that we will have uh, justice being given the kind of priority that it deserves. And in terms of the responses, I would like to quickly run you through the responses that India can actually try and bring into this gamut. First of all, as a country, we will have a number of opportunities to expand our own reach, but this requires the strengthening of our own political, economic, and even health systems. And we've seen this in the last few months, how uh, you know political, economic, and health systems were under immense pressure. Politically, I think we must make sure that there is a vibrant democracy. Then there is emphasis on equality, dignity for all, and also economic development that must factor in the concerns of the farmers, the workers, particularly the workers who are at the bottom of the pyramid, and including the migrant laborers, and also health system. Our budget, for instance, is quite less. It's just about less than 4%. But whereas some countries spend even about 15 to 16% of their GDP on health system. So there is an imperative to increase that. And we also have seen the way the Indian government or a number of governments tended to treat the rich and the middle class vis-a-vis the poor migrants. And so therefore there is an imperative to call for care for all, not just the rich. And I hope this will, in some ways, be factored into the responses that we're going to have as a country. And in terms of our response to China, we need to bring in both the distant past and also the 1962, and also more recently, how we've been trying to forge robust ties, including the trade and also development. In this context, I must bring in what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the architect, not only the architect, but the theoretician, the leader, and also thinker, and also somebody, a statesman, who said that India must strive every nerve, must seek every context, every aid to make ourselves strong. Then only our voice will be effective. If we want to be globally, heard, then we must, as Dr. Ambedkar would underscore, strive every nerve, must seek every aid to make herself strong. Then only our voice will be effective. So therefore, in this context, what we must do is we must pursue the path of both peace and power, not just power, but also peace. And if China, but of course, persists its expansionist policies, then we must strengthen the quadrilateral security dialogue so that we will not face a repeat of 1962. And in terms of civil society must, in fact, we're all part of civil society. We must highlight and fight for the voiceless and the marginalized. And it is where I think I would bring in Martin Luther King Jr. once again. He said, protest because it is right to protest for what is right. I think many times we try not to protest because we think protest is wrong. But Dr. King would say that we must protest because it is right to protest for what is right. I mean, when we are protesting for what is right, then it is imperative that we protest. And then as individuals, I think we all must introspect, especially as to how many of us pray for the international issues daily. I think in our own family, we make it a point that we do pray for this. But of course, also act on that. And as leaders and pastors, how many of our leaders and pastors, especially leaders who lead the organizations, how many of us actually pray for and preach on these issues? And finally, participate in protests is something that whenever there is a need, we must, not hesitate and shy away from protesting, because it is, when we are protesting for what is right, it is right to protest. And concluding remarks, let me just conclude the discussion. International relations, in fact, is going through a new phase requiring a comprehensive understanding coupled with a well-calibrated grand strategy. And I hope we will evolve one of that. But while doing it, the focus has to be on the importance of principles and their pivotal role in international relations. And therefore, it is imperative for us to focus and factor into international relations the view that principles without power are weak and power without principles is dangerous. Let me reiterate that. Principles without power are weak and power without principles is dangerous. And therefore, we need to highlight the issues of transparency, equality, dignity, and justice for not for few, but not for the rich, not for the middle class, but all. And this must include countries, companies, institutions, and individuals. And it is here India and China need the international system as much as international system needs them. And if China's rise continues, it will have major ramifications for global politics. And therefore, India must factor this into our. And finally, being wary of authoritarian tendencies, both at the international and the national levels, we must tread towards being more inclusive, just, and equitable. So therefore, that requires a kind of a paradigm shift from just activist policy that we now have to a well-calibrated global policy that actually factors the ideals of democracy, transparency, inclusivity, besides being realistic in our approach and strategy. Thank you.